Good day to everyone. I would like to welcome all the participants in this conversation and also all the wonderful speakers who have joined us today in this dialogue. And today's theme is feminist dialogue on values, culture, and religion. And we're holding this dialogue in conjunction with the Middle East Studies Association conference, annual conference. The Middle East Studies Association, MESA, is a congregation of over 3,000 scholars and professors from around the world. And we have, as for us, I think it's a wonderful connection, a wonderful contact into the academia. And also for them, we have tried to bring global activists and leaders on gender and on culture to the conference regularly. And I recall some of these events with great joy and happiness. One of them was a plenary we held right following the United Nations Human Rights Conference in Vienna. And I had the honor and privilege to be on a plenary with my friend, the Moroccan philosopher, Fatma Mernissi, and the Egyptian activist, Nawal Saadawi. And this plenary was on the theme, more or less the same theme that we are talking about today. And to tell you the truth, I'm also sort of puzzled that this was in 1993, and there has been no similar plenary at this distinguished conference ever since. So well, I hope that we will be able to replicate it in one way or another soon. But what is really amazing is that even though we haven't had a plenary on gender the way we had before, we have had 9 presidents of the Middle East Studies Association in this period, which goes to show if women are asked to be candidates, they get elected, you know, and so this is what we have to look to. And also, I would like to tell you a little bit about the trajectory of this conversation we have today, because it is actually this year coincides with the 20th year of the creation of WLP. And during this period, we have one of the areas in which we have tried to work is interfaith conversations and connection of gender and culture, as we are going to be talking about today. I just want you to remember that this conversation was a very difficult one in feminist circles. When we first began, right around the time that I was mentioning with the MESA's plenary, it was really very difficult for feminist gatherings to refer back to faith or to cultural values. It was almost a taboo subject. So we organized a group that worked on this topic and its significant importance for the women's movement. And one of the products of that was creation of a manual called Claiming Our Rights, which was bringing to Muslim women the in sessions that were like stories, and in solutions to the decisions that were asked to be made through the narratives, they had quotes from the Quran, examples from the leading figures of religion, and at the same time the Declaration of Human Rights. So they could see that they are capable, they are allowed, they don't need even that validation. They can decide between these various documents, and they can make up their own minds how they want to decide, depending on their culture and the where they are in on the scale of historical change. And so that manual, I can say probably, because the speakers can talk about that, but it really was an amazing success. It was featured in New York Times. some of the extraordinary people to bring together were people like Gloria Steinem and Abdullahi and Naim. They both from different aspects of society validated it and talked about it, and it was in 13 languages and went all over the world and is still being used. The reason I say that is because to bring out the complexity of the connection between religion and feminism. Following that, we had a huge conference on Muslim women called Faith and Freedom, and that was also followed by an anthology that was launched in Beijing. And I'm proud to see that Karima, who's with us today, was on the panel where we presented the same type of conversation in Beijing, which was also the only conversation that had to do with this theme. And then, of course, I just go faster and tell you at the event that changed the whole shape of not only the Middle East, but also gender relations across the global south considerably, and that was 9/11. 9/11 happened, and we had this horrific sense of loss and horror. But all of the leading women with whom we brought together on radio programs with feminist radio and with other media, they were almost united in sympathy, in understanding, in seeing it as a crime, and wanting to move beyond and understand each other better. We had also an interfaith conversation at the American University, which featured a multi-faith group, among them our dear Asa Karam and also Marian Edelman. So this was how we felt about it and how all of these people across the world who were our allies felt about it. But unfortunately, it evolved into a war, and it was not a crime, but a war. And it ended up to be a war on Islam and almost by definition on religion. So what I'm saying from the beginning of these conversations to today, there also have been extraordinary advances, extraordinary understandings of how important faith is in shaping values and shaping cultures, diverse as they might be, that can all lead to unity and power for half of the population, which is women, and also the other half, because it is so interconnected with the other half. So that's just a look at the task we have accomplished. But then again, it's not a straight up kind of journey. In a few years after 9/11, we had a huge gathering at the cathedral in Washington, where powerful people from around the world gathered to talk about the relationship between faith and development. And there were heads of state, there were bishops, there were of all sorts of variety of people. That particular gathering that had about 1,500 people from around the world featured people like Mary Robinson, Kim Campbell, Soraya Obaid, as well as Bishop Tutu and some celebrities. We raised $1 billion in that conference to go to integrating faith organizations with gender concepts and ideas and culture change, which is so significant to all that we want to achieve. But all of that sometimes makes some of us who are activists and have had a history in this together and also with other allies, some of us think, why haven't we done more? Why do we have this horrific world that today we are facing? Why haven't we been able to get the half of the population that has never had a role that it should have, be able to participate across these fields to have culture change. And but then, you know, sometimes we see the positive aspect. The very fact that we're here together and we have a few hundred people listening, and probably many thousands will see this conversation later, we have other opportunities, and we have a particular awareness of our interconnectedness and a particular sense of urgency and existential survival that we've never had before. That's why our conversation today, I think, can be so important, and how precious it is that on the 20th anniversary of WLP, we are having this conversation with you and having an enlightened audience, many of them from the Middle East Studies Association, the researchers and the professors. And we look forward to this great dialogue, and think that maybe this one will have consequences because of the timing, because of what we have suffered, and because of our new understanding of the importance of our togetherness. Perhaps we will be able to move ahead more speedily and more effectively. And now I want to turn this over to our fantastic chair of WLP and a leading figure in this particular movement, as well as many others, that brings gender and enriches it with all aspects of development and feminist conceptualization. So Musimbi, thank you.
Thank you, Mahnaz. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night from wherever in the world you are listening. We are indeed very delighted as Women's Learning Partnership with Middle East University to host this forum. And you've just been listening to Mahnaz Afkami, who is our CEO of the Women's Learning Partnership and has quite a lot of achievements in her own life, in addition to the achievements that she has mentioned for the organization itself. But I'm joined here with a very remarkable group of feminists, women feminists, who will be participating in this dialogue. And I will introduce them momentarily. In feminist thinking, it's always important that when you want to comment on something, when you want to participate in something, that you own up. So I'm going to begin by a little bit of an introduction of how I personally own this dialogue, a dialogue on shared feminist visions. And so let me do a little bit of more introduction of myself within this context. Faith has always been an important part of my life, but I really became a feminist inside the church and by studying feminist theology. I grew up in a community where religion and spirituality were important values and practices, and thus I inherited faith as part of childhood growing. Didn't think about it. It was just a normal thing. We respected when in the morning we woke up to the call for Muslim prayers, because we live in a community that is mixed, both Christians and Muslim, for Muslim prayers. And we also saw people go to pray on different days, on Sundays and on Saturdays and on Fridays. And sometimes during the week, we saw people who prayed using different forms of prayers. But my own family was a Quaker family. And in Quaker, the most important thing you are trained to think about is to think about the others, and to think about peace, and to think about what you can contribute towards justice. So for me, when I became a feminist, what was important for me is that somehow I came to be convinced that God is a God of justice. And so for me, I saw my feminism as nothing less than worrying with God about the things that God worries about when God wakes up in the morning. I wanted to be part of that. What does God worry about? If this is God of justice, what does God worry about when God wakes up in the morning? I had learned from the Bible that God made human beings in God's own image. And I heard Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, who was then the president of Tanzania, I'm Kenyan by birth, one day say, if human beings are made in the image of God, then God is that child who has over the eyes because they are sick. Then God is in that woman who is almost dying when they are giving birth to a child. Then that is really the image of God. And he named many, many things. He named God so that I could see God as a poor person, as a woman, as a farmer, as a child, as anything. And I said, yes, if we are made in the image of God, and God represents all of these things that we are, the good and the bad, then I think I want to be involved in doing some of that work that God does. But what really shaped the difference between other things that we participated on is that faith came with a lot of promise for hope. That was what was the difference. It was bringing hope, so that it was saying that if you want to go to work for justice, you must hope that that justice is going to come. Because to hope for justice and peace meant to work for eliminating injustice and being a peacemaker. That's what it takes if you hope for something. And that hope is radical. You don't sit down and wait for it. You actually fight for it. That was very important for me, that hope is radical. You got to do something about it. And that hope invites practice and invites others to work along with you. Hope is not something you own by yourself. It can't just be, I hope to be this by myself. You hope for bigger things. So over time, as I studied feminist theology, I began to see what the feminist vision looks like. Because then I saw that a lot of injustice that exists in the world in which we live actually is injustice that singles out the females. There is so much injustice, and you know a lot of them, so I will not be saying, and our speakers will speak to many of those injustices as well. But I want to just quickly say two things, which I think have been important for me because we did them from a faith perspective. One was in 1989, while in a meeting of many ecumenical groups in Geneva, where I was living at that particular time, a message came to this meeting that said that a woman had been killed in El Salvador. And in a few minutes, as we finished this meeting, the women who were in that place said, we have to do something about it, because so much was happening in El Salvador at that particular time. And so we quickly thought of an idea of what needed to be done. And we said it was important to organize ecumenical visits to El Salvador from all over the world, and quite quickly gather the women of the world to go. And for 6 weeks, without stop, every week, we had women organized from many different countries traveling to El Salvador to keep company, to gather information, with 1 or 2 days in between for them to show what was happening, and to meet with the women who are on the ground and acting for justice. And we learned so much, and it was called the Chain of Hope for Cristina Gomez. By the time that this was finished, so many people had participated in this solidarity visit, and it also enabled another 1,000 women to meet in El Salvador. And it was during this particular time when so much was happening, and just through the visits of women who felt the vision is the vision of solidarity, a vision of hope that they can do something, a lot became changed in that country through the solidarity. So that's one example. The second and last one that I'll say is a number of us women led by one of the women from Africa, Masio Dioye, realized that religion and culture were being used to add on the patriarchal oppression that we had on our country, and the voices of women were not present because we were not writing, we were not speaking up. So we organized ourselves again. We organized ourselves in what still exists today, 35 years later, called the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. And basically what we are Christians, we are Muslims, we are Jewish, we are African traditional religions. What we do is that we reflect within our societies using the faith leanings from which we have grown, and we decided to stay in those faith upbringing spaces because we knew that if we go away, we won't have the legitimacy to speak from outside. If you speak from inside, you know what is happening. And we wanted to change both how faith communities see women, but also how our community embraces changes that we want. And we still do this work together. We published over 100 books together, and we are strong, and now we are working on climate change together. These are two examples that I wanted to show, where I feel that a feminist vision tells us, you're not gonna do this alone. A feminist vision tells us that you need to be able to empower those people who are most impacted. And a feminist vision tells us that you need to organize so that you can get the resources that people need to make the changes. So that's where I'm coming from. I still own the faith, and I'm very aware of the things that bring women down within faith communities, some of which we get embarrassed about. And I'm determined with many other people that we work on those things. And I own that a woman has a right to make her own decisions on every matter under the earth here. So I feel that that's what a just God would like us to do, to be able to have that freedom on ourselves. So that's myself. I've owned up about this. And now I'm going to introduce you to the panelists who will take both the ability to tell us part of what they are doing, but also their own engagement in the life of their work. I want to introduce them all together very shortly, and so that it will be easy for me to facilitate the conversation between them and among ourselves. So we have Karima Benyoun is one of the panelists. Karima, if you could show, yes. And Karima is a professor at a professor of law at University of Davis School of Law, which is in California. And she is also the United Nations Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. And she's the author of many books, and some of them are books that bring out both faith and culture. I also want to introduce Lopa Banaje, who is the director of the Civil Society Division of the UN Women. And she is also leading the strategic engagement of partnership and development with the civil society. And currently she's leading the Generation Equality, which is our way of celebrating where we are coming from with the 25 years since Beijing, but also the future of engaging the next generation of young people and of feminists to continue what we began in Beijing. The third panelist I'm introducing is Wendy Goldberg. And Wendy is the executive director and founding member of the Trier Faith Initiative, which is very interesting. It has all the multi-faith, the ecumenism that you can think about. And she served on the board of the trustees of the Temple of Israel for 10 years, including 2-year term as the president of that congregation. And we will be able to hear more from her as she talks. And then Aza Karama, who is the Secretary General of Religions for Peace International. And Aza is not only that, but she is actually one of the people that I have known for many years, being able to convene interfaith conversations, including the position that she had before with UNFPA that really brought change in how we in multilateral organizations, including the UN, are able to embrace faith and be able to give people opportunity to engage themselves in the agenda, in our common agenda of the United Nations, with bringing faith on the table. So you can see that plus Magnus, who I have introduced, we have a very strong panel. And so I'm gonna just start by asking them some questions and have some interactions, and feel free to send your questions on in Q&A, and we'll pick and also ask them some of the questions that you have. Let me begin with you, Karima, please. Karima, you are a professor of international law and the current UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. What is the added value of taking cultural rights perspective in the questions of feminism, culture, and faith? And how do you ask yourself, Karima, immerse yourself in the work that you're doing?
Thank you very much for the question, and many thanks to the Women's Learning Partnership for this convening today. It's wonderful to be with all of you, and really my solidarity to the women human rights defenders everywhere, including in the WLP, who are trying to continue the work today in the face of the pandemic and all the challenges that it is bringing. So back to your question, I am the Special Rapporteur on cultural rights. Cultural rights may be less familiar to some of the audience than other human rights, but I really do think a cultural rights perspective can be a very helpful one as a framework for this discussion. Among the rights that I work on, that I work to defend, is the right to take part in cultural life for everyone, and everyone means everyone, without discrimination. This includes, of course, the right to take part in religious and cultural practices or not to take part in them. That's very important. The right to have access to cultural and religious sites in equality and in dignity, the equal right to be cultural and religious leaders, the equal right to participate in defining and redefining culture. And my predecessor as Special Rapporteur, Farida Shahid, a very prominent woman human rights defender from Pakistan, wrote a very important report in 2012 about women's cultural rights, arguing that it was important to transcend just a negative vision of culture when we think about women's human rights, but also to fight for women's equal right to participate in all aspects of cultural life. And I think it's very important to have that holistic vision. And this reminds us that, you know, women's rights to do all of these things, to participate equally in culture and religion, those rights are guaranteed by international law. So that's a critical tool and a critical framing. Part of the cultural rights perspective is also about cultural diversity. It is a reminder to us that women, that feminists are very diverse. They belong to many different religious traditions, or they may be descended from those traditions. They may practice or believe even within any given tradition in a very wide range of ways. They may make connections between their beliefs and their sort of feminist advocacy and activism, or they may not, in many different ways. And there are, of course, also many, many non-religious women and women who come to feminism with a non-religious perspective. And it's really important to honor all of those voices in the dialogues that we need to have. Another piece of the cultural rights perspective is about the grounding in universality. So cultural rights are guaranteed in international human rights law, which provides universal human rights to everyone. Cultural rights are not the same thing as cultural relativism. They are not an override for equality, for commitments to non-discrimination. They are not a justification for violence. And I think it's very important as we have this discussion that we remember those red lines. We are talking about engaging with culture and religion and a diversity of beliefs to the end of achieving human rights and equality. And I think the cultural rights perspective is one set of tools and frameworks that can help us in that goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Karima. Lopa, you are now meeting so many women who are interacting in the generation equality. What do you think is the feminist vision today? because part of our conversation is on feminist vision. And do you think we have a common understanding on what this is? Do you think it embraces some of what Karima has said? And just take it on.
Thank you so much, Musimbi. And it's so wonderful to be here in this conversation with such amazing, amazing feminists and scholars and activists and leaders. Thank you so much to to WLP for inviting UN Women and me to this conversation. I'm delighted to be here. You know, Musimbi, historically, a feminist vision has been a vision for rights and peace, not only individual rights and peace, but actually creating cultures of rights and peace for all. And it has been always based on plurality, solidarity, and intersectionality. Women and girls in all of the ways in which they live and are in the world and would like to be in the world. So that's been at its core. And it has also been about strengthening each other and citizens and people's activism, commitment to the principles of achieving substantive equality, recognizing that the underlying opportunities and discriminations around what equality of opportunities is, what equal treatment is, what equality in outcome and in parity can be. This has been the vision of feminism for a long time, and that is why the feminist movement has been the longest running substantive movement for equality, bar none, because it has always been such an inclusive perspective of being and of social justice across many years. Today, we are at a time when we are really at an inflection point. Before COVID, you know, we have been talking about the sluggish progress for gender equality. And the feminists and feminist movement have been talking about the sluggish progress. And when I say sluggish progress, you know, nothing speaks like statistics. Let me just talk about what I mean when I say sluggish progress. You know, 25 years, if we take Beijing, it's actually more than 25 years. You go back to CEDAW, which is, you know, over 40 years. But even if I take Beijing as a starting point, so 25 years, in the 25 years. Today, men are 75% of parliamentarians. They hold 73% of managerial positions across the world and are 70% of climate negotiators and almost all of the peace negotiators. So across all dimensions of public life, women do not even have a quarter of the voice that they need at the tables. If we look at the gender gap in labor force participation, it has remained unchanged between 1998 and 2018 at 31%. And this participation is concentrated in precarious forms of work. We know that women carry a disproportionate burden of care, at performing an average of 3 times as much as unpaid care work as men. And then on violence, you know, the 2020 report of the Secretary General on gender equality, 25 years after Beijing, found that 18% of women aged between 15 and 49 years who had intimate partners had been subjected to sexual or physical violence by these partners in the last 12 months. And this rises to 24% in some countries. More than 2.5 billion women and girls are affected by discriminatory laws all over the world. And I can go on, but I will not. All I want to say is, why do I say we are at an inflection point? Because what COVID has done is it has both illuminated these inequalities and exacerbated them. On the issue of violence, in 5 months from the time that COVID started across the world, let's say in January or February, to April and May, in 5 months, we saw violence go up 30% in the world over already this base that exists. Unpaid care work tripled over and above the current scenario that already exists. And this at a time when women are playing a disproportionate role in the care work for COVID. Women form more than 70% of healthcare workers and frontline workers everywhere. So this is where we are. And this is why I'm saying we are at an inflection point, because the vision of feminism today, a feminist vision today, has to be not only about radical urgency and impatience, but really about a no quarters asked demand for transformation that really center stages the idea of care. You see, we are looking, if you look at what has been the response to COVID across the world, people across the world have gathered in communities of care, informal structures. They've created networks. They've stepped in where leaders and political systems have failed. People have created their own networks of care. Plural, inclusive, cobbled together in communities, they've come across. And that radical concept of care for everyone, interdependence, solidarity, and the understanding that we cannot continue on this individualistic path of patriarchal capitalism, but that we are fundamentally connected. If this pandemic has done anything, it has pointed to the frailty and fragility of a patriarchal economic system, and has pointed to the solidarity-based interdependence that is the only, not only the means of survival, but that is the only means of sustainability and transformation going forward.
Thank you. And Lopa, if you have the statistics link, can you put it on the chat? Some people would like to have those statistics that you talked about. Or if you want them to refer to the website of the UN Women, I'll also say, do look also at the website of UN Women. There are a lot of documents that are great to use. As I want to come to you, and I want to actually change a little bit about how I was going to talk to you, because I feel almost like how I always feel about the reality in which we live in the world today, that very often it's such a, we almost feel like we are moving forward and then we move back so many steps. And the hope in us almost seems to be very challenged. So you are the Secretary General of the Religions for Peace, which is the world's oldest global multi-religious leadership platform with 90 different national interreligious councils, etc. These are really a lot of people who are doing their work from a faith perspective. Where's the hope? Where's the hope for us as women? Where's the feminist hope? What can you contribute? And you can comment on COVID and any other, but show us how we move towards hope.
Thank you very much, Musimbi. And I would like to follow a particular tradition of the indigenous communities around the world to pay tribute to the space where we are today, even though we are virtually connected to one another, but to pay tribute to the land on which we still stand, on which we hope to serve and survive. In the same vein, I'd like to pay tribute to the women leaders who have inspired and taught with their courage and continue to. That would include Mahnaz Afkami, who, as humble as she is, has managed to steward an incredibly courageous journey, which she has outlined parts of, just very sketches of, by also deciding to take the bull by the horn. And that particular set of horns belonged to a bull called faith, and culture when it comes to feminism already a long time ago, and by so doing establishing a tradition almost now within the diverse feminist spaces around the world. So chapeau to Mahnaz Afkami and the Women's Learning Partnership. And in the same vein, Musimbi, the work you did with your African women theologians to create the Circle of Concerned Women African Theologians, which has set a trend for many of those inspiring, aspiring, committed women who value their faith traditions enough to see that this is also the way for them to achieve not just equality with male counterparts in male-dominated societies, but to achieve a very clear betterment of the whole of society through ensuring that the most vulnerable within have visibility, access, potential, opportunity, power, and leadership, and doing so all within the framework of the inspiration and the words of different faith traditions. What you have done, Musimbi, is equally a legacy building that I would also raise my heart to. So thank you. Every single woman on this panel has done an amazing set of jobs. And if we were just to compare, it would take the rest of the conversation away. So I just want to pay humble tribute to each and all of you. Your question is where we get the hope from. Well, quite frankly, from the work that you and Mahnaz and Lopa and Karima and our colleague Wendy all do. We look at where our faith traditions inspire. Many of us, 8 out of 10 people, according to a 2012 poll by the Pew Research Center, 8 out of 10 people around the world are believers or claim a particular affiliation to a particular religion. That's a remarkable amount of people around the world. And yet somehow we've managed to have a slight dissonance between a very secular feminist perspective and a very faith-based and faith-inspired feminist perspective, which is why it's important that we continue this trend established by Mahnaz and the Women's Learning Partnership to build the bridges between these different communities. Not because they're not there, they are there, but they need to be more visible, more engaged and engaging for the rest of us. Let me please clarify that when I speak of feminism, my understanding is that it is two things. One, an awareness that women often get the short end of the stick and the short stick in the straw dissemination of life, systematically, but also not just women and girls, which means that per definition, the boys and the men are not getting a very fine stick either, quite frankly. But that in comparison, we are talking about a more vulnerable meeting out of opportunities and resources to women. So it's an awareness of that, a very clear, guided, evidence-informed awareness of that, as we heard from the many things you have shared and what the statistics and the evidence that Lopa has shared. But the second part of that feminism is an intentionality to work to try to change that status quo, to try to ensure that not just girls and women, but boys and men and all other gender identities have a fair chance at a decent, dignified life. To me, that is what I understand by feminism. So there is no contradiction, therefore, in my understanding between holding on and being able to deeply appreciate my own faith tradition and every single other faith tradition, because it makes absolutely no sense to think that my faith tradition has all the answers. If I believe, and I am a believer, if I believe in my faith tradition, it also instructs me to be respectful about every single other faith tradition. That to me is belief. And that is to me what a feminist inspiration of faith and a faith-inspired feminism is all about. It's being able to merge and marry those consciousness, the consciousness of where women are at, girls and women in today's society, and the harm that this impacts on all society going forward, the willingness to work on and with and for the transformation of that particular status quo for all, and the understanding that a faith-inspired activism and engagement can inform that social common good for all. So that's where I come from in this space, and that's where I know that many of the women on this call are also very much rooted and working in. And I think this, to be honest, is the new way of working for women and girls and men and boys. This really is a new way in the sense that it was there before, but as we heard before, it wasn't considered sort of the chic thing to do. It wasn't really in. I think COVID is facing us with a situation where we have to fundamentally reevaluate our cultural understandings, our mental state of mind, our political, social, and financial worldviews. COVID is forcing us, because it's impacting on everybody, it's forcing us to reimagine our geopolitical dynamics at the same time that we have to re-envision our cultures of activism and faith-inspired feminism. A faith-inspired feminism is not exclusive of those who are working in the feminist space who don't necessarily have any belief system. On the contrary, again, if my faith tradition demands that I respect every faith tradition, it demands equally that I respect all of the other creatures that this divine has created, including those who have no faith. Well, otherwise, what's the value added of being faith-inspired if it is to create yet another set of boundaries and divisions between me and my fellow men and women? What would be the value added? Zero. In order to make sure that there is a value added, there has to be an appreciation of the inherent dignity of all humans, because it is a reflection of the divine. It's as simple as that. Nobody's better than anybody. No religion is better than another religion, and no non-religion is better than no religion. The distinctions, the differences, the binaries, the dichotomies that Enlightenment thinking has bequeathed to all of us in the world have to be thoroughly and completely challenged, have to be thoroughly and completely thrown away. We need to re-envision what we are doing slowly together today, and for the last, since the 1994 summit, we have been systematically trying to walk together on this journey where all that which puts boundaries between you and I is being shattered systematically, because the belief in the divine, whatever that form is fundamentally a belief for working together all the time. One of the most amazing things that I am still trying to get over, and I may never get over this, by the way, so bear with me. I thought that the COVID pandemic was going to force all these different religious institutions to work together. That was like, this is it, guys. We have to now come together in solidarity. Everybody's suffering this. And I realized that few are, but frankly, it has also brought out, just like any other crises bring out the best and the worst of us, right? To be honest, I think that religious institutions and organizations who in the last few years have come to light as great paragons of support and virtue to social communities, to mobilization, to human rights, whatever, I realize that many are focused on serving communities for sure, because they're the first responders in humanitarian crises anyway, we know that. But I realize that everyone's working in their own silo. Yes, serving everybody, but still working in their own institutional silos. And it kind of breaks my heart, because the whole point of a global pandemic is to generate a global response that brings us all together, not forces us to go back into our respective silos and to hide within the cocoons that we are used to institutionally, mentally, culturally, and politically. And I think we're at this moment where we have to do something that the feminist movement originally taught, manifested, and we might have forgotten a little bit about it, which is to be self-reflexive, a little bit self-critical, in a very constructive way, but to be a little bit self-critical. We think we may know it all. Actually, perhaps we don't. Perhaps the entire movement, social movement spectrum, perhaps all these movements need a healthy dose of self-criticism. Perhaps our institutions, who are today doing an amazing job and fighting their own destitution, because institutions today are destitute and losing totally much legitimacy and credibility. Perhaps our own institutions, who are struggling at the apex of defending and understanding their own vulnerability as institutions, need to be a little bit more self-critical about what it is that they think they know and how it is that they think they're working. I think a little dose of self-reflexivity that we can share in a common space together would be extremely helpful for us, because frankly, none of us have the right answer to all the issues. All of us are struggling. The point is, are we coming together in that struggle, including those of us who absolutely do not see eye to eye? But we are committed. God has provided us, shall we put, I was going to say blighted, but God forbid, we have a moment of opportunity that we're all suffering together simultaneously. Surely this is the moment we come together in our differences, with our differences, to try to see how we can support, because everybody is suffering. There is no other moment like this. And we better learn it now, because if we don't learn it now, we will be confronted with this again and again and again. The karmic cycle doesn't stop. Thank you.
So, Wendy, it just looks to me when I see the work that you do, the trial that you do, you are trying to create a bit of that picture that Aza talked about. What is the secret ingredient?
Thank you. What a privilege to be present with all of you today. And thank you for creating this container for us to have such meaningful dialogue with each other. I'm so inspired to be part of this and to know how much work all of you are doing in the world. I think I'm humbled. And a piece of that is that our work happens in Omaha, Nebraska, in the heartland, where we have co-located a church, a mosque, and a synagogue with an interfaith center with intention over 15 years to realize that one relationship at a time, we have an opportunity to hear the voice of the other, particularly the religious other, but in the shifting religious landscape, perhaps even more so in North America, the shift away from religious affiliation. I don't believe that shift is away from the pursuit of a community of meaning. The next generation, for certain, is interested in a more perfect union and creating a democracy where we are able to celebrate religious diversity as and religious pluralism as a social norm. And so how do we model that as an incubator for the rest of the world, to be able to say that people of faith and of no faith can come together to hear each other's narrative. And so the secret ingredient is in fact listening. And in my faith, in the Jewish faith, the watchword of our faith is the blessing or the prayer, the Shema. And it invites us to deeply listen to each other, to create brave space in order to hear each other and to appreciate that there's more than one path to something bigger than us, and our God has many names. And that, and yet in Judaism, it's monotheism, and that we can appreciate through the Trifaith Initiative that when we come together and hear each other, that is beautiful. Now, in terms of a feminist perspective, the challenge isn't that women are engaged in religious life. In fact, the statistics tell us that women are more engaged in religious community, in congregational affiliation, in congregational leadership. But how we shush women and we don't amplify those voices, or we say that everyone needs to be heard. COVID and the systemic injustice that has been uncovered in 2020 and is not new to any of us. We all know that these systems have been broken for generations, but the uncovering, the lamentation of the pain that we are collectively suffering through at the local and the international level is exactly the moment for us to uncover what is the systemic issue that has been created that is limiting us from betterment, from coming together as human beings and appreciating the opportunity to bring together our intersectional identity, and the equity that is mismatched, I think, in my perspective, is that men's voices get amplified louder and appreciated louder, and that we as women don't come together often enough to support each other. And it's not even network, it's to get each other's back. And the Me Too movement is a beautiful example where women have and need to, particularly in faith communities, come together to address the issues of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, and to support each other in those messages. And how do we work behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, to be able to use our faith to stand for the just world that we believe in and that we work for. The Trifaith Initiative is a beautiful example of where we can witness the opportunity to tell each other our faith stories and how that calls us into action, But I think it's important to remember how important that micro level, that local response. And sometimes, you know, I say in my work, there's never going to be a day that I wake up and I can check a box that says social cohesion. We've completed that, right? But I can wake up every morning and think of that concept of compounding interest. That my father's favorite thing to say was, watch the pennies and the dollars will fall. And I believe this is true in our movements, both around sustaining faith and feminism, that if we wake up every day and we do our little piece in our community, that will be the change we prove to see and need to see in this world. And if we believe it's too big for us and that the little things that we do at the community level aren't going to change what happens at the UN, we're wrong. And it truly is each human being believing that they're created in that divine image, that the work that they wake up and do through their vote, through their post, through their email matters. And until we amplify the voice, we quiet the voices of those who are too loud. By amplifying the voices of those that are unheard, we won't see change. And so what do I do as a woman of privilege? I amplify the voice of women who are underheard. And through that, I've learned so much. So thank you for inviting me. I know we're running shorter on time, so I'd love to leave some time for a few more questions to follow up.
Yeah. I'm picking up, thank you so much, Wendy. I'm picking up the questions that are coming from the Q&A and from the chat. And a number of them deal with the idea that feminism is distorted today, and others feeling that what kind of agenda can we do that is sufficiently intersectional in feminism, etc. And so I want to give each one of you, and this one I want to go really fast. We've made our major speech, and I'm going to be including you also, Mahnaz. But I want you to say two things which you think are helpful to address our feminism today, which we could do different to empower, to strengthen our feminism today. And if you can keep to two things and just say them, it gives us opportunity to take a few more questions. Lopa, get us started.
Thanks, Musimbi. So two things. One is to be really mindful about the fact that as we are speaking about this inflection point, everything that, for example, Azab pointed to about, you know, how we have to be working together, let's be clear that right now, in the responses to COVID that are going on in the world, they are continuing to exacerbate inequalities. We have not yet come up. Our governments and the COVID responses are right now still not addressing a comprehensive community-based, community-centered response. So our feminist response, working with faith institutions, faith leaders who command that equity and power, the fact is to draw attention to the COVID response so that it is about this intersectional, all-encompassing, with community at its core response. That's number one. Number two, very clearly, what we have seen repeatedly pre-COVID and during COVID is the activism of people. It is about people coming together in groups, in communities, and strengthening their activism as response to COVID, but overall as system change for a culture of rights individually and for the community. That activism has to be at the center, strengthened as a central piece of the COVID response. So when we talk in terms of building back better, it's not building back better patriarchy. It is about a transformation agenda, and that means supporting and strengthening power where it belongs, which is among the people.
Thank you. And Mahnaz, what would you put on the table? Briefly again. 2, 1, 2. You are muted. Unmute yourself.
I would say one. Okay, I would say that many have pointed to this idea that I'm saying, that the situation we are facing now, as everyone has said, is exacerbated the bad stuff that are going on around the world. And now, for once, we have an opportunity to connect. But maybe it is to connect in the way that is new. We are half of the population containing all the other minorities. We're black, white, red, whatever. We are different religions. We are disabled and strong. We are all of these things. Instead of working in silos, trying to say the other half of humanity is doing more than we are, and we want to be at least as much as them, we want to rethink, and I think several have mentioned that, rethink feminism, rethink the organization of human interaction. And if there is time at some point, I'll say we'll have to start in the family and with women in each family. Thank you.
There's a good contribution from one of the participants who says we have to make a link between secular feminists and faith-based feminists. And I can tell you that that's not only true, but it's the fact that it's many people who do their work in the secular world might be also faith-based, but feminists as well. I have, for example, worked throughout most of my life in the secular world and a lot of time. And I think that that's a very good bridge that you are asking to build. Karima, what are your two things?
So thank you very much. It's hard to narrow it down to two, but here are my top two priorities, I think, at the moment in this area. The first is that we come together as women with diverse perspectives, working within different faith traditions or in a more secular way, and we defend concepts of science, reason, and evidence, and the importance of making public policy decisions on the basis of science, reason, and evidence, because I am very worried about the drift away from that. We see this in the discussions around COVID and the safety measures, health and safety measures needed around COVID. We see this around women's sexual and reproductive rights. And you know, there may be some debates about science and feminist critiques of some of the ways in which science has been used, but I think it's so important at the moment when these basic concepts are under attack that we defend them. I would also say that coming together as women working within faith-based frameworks and women working in other frameworks for feminist goals, it is also very important to be very clear about our defense of the separation of religion and state. So I think this in no way takes away from respecting people's right to come to feminism from a faith-based perspective, but it's the framework within which we can all operate with a diversity of perspectives. And I really listen to voices like secularism is a women's rights issue, which says that secularism is basically a precondition for the struggle for women's human rights. It guarantees the rights of religious minorities, the rights of women of faith and not, the rights of dissenting members of the majority. The separation of religion and state, I think, is a critical principle that we need to underscore in these days. It's sort of unpopular and perhaps politically incorrect often to do that, but I think with all of our diversity of perspectives and respecting the coalitions and the different strategies that women use, this is a sort of basic principle to which we must really return.
Yeah, excellent. And Wendy, what are your two?
My first would be humility, and to realize that no more than my space, but no less than my place. Meaning there's an opportunity, anava is what it's called in Hebrew, and the concept that there are moments that we need to make space for others, and there are moments we need to take our place and to stand strong for what we believe in and for. And the next, I think, is a healthy dose of wonder and curiosity, to realize that we have something to learn from each other and with each other, and by hearing each other's stories. And sometimes we start with the politics and the work, and instead if we started with the relationship, and really getting to know people as human beings and to build trust, we would make more progress in our work. Thank you.
And Asa, what are you too?
Thank you. And I just want to echo what everyone else has said, especially the advocacy for humility that Wendy very rightfully pointed out. I think we miss that a lot in our current geopolitical and leadership discourses. We don't seem to have a humility feature in any way, shape, or form. Might be helpful to actually have that at all levels. Also wanted to say that I think one of the things we're missing globally, in addition to what our colleagues have said, is the ability to think as women, think all for one and one for all. Let's try to be a little bit more of a musketeer framework. We have plenty to learn from those who oppress us too, by the way. And this is a good thing. This ability to come together is a very, very valuable thing. Our institutions need it, the UN needs it, and we as feminists who are inspired by our faith traditions or no faith at all also need to learn how to stand together and to support one another. So I just want to say that I think that's going to be an important tipping point, not only for us, but also for the world. And I noticed one of the comments is that we need to learn how to celebrate more than just bemoan. And I think we certainly need to make a point of having the celebratory narratives of our different successes, individual, regional, global. It's very important to learn from what we have done already and what our ancestors and the women who fought so hard to give us rights that we take so much for granted today, important to honor and celebrate them too. Thank you.
One of some of the areas that I think are really important to look at from the perspective of those people that are engaged within religious community is the growing, increasing conservatism, fundamentalism, regressive governments that are actually taking away the achievements that women have made. And in fact, it is those behaviors that very often make people very cautious about what do we do with religion and what we do with them, thinking from the perspective of faith. Wendy, do you have something you could say about that?
Wow, you caught me a little bit off guard. I'm going to pass that on to someone else first, if that's okay.
Who would like to offer? Just put your hand up to say something on it.
Would you mind repeating the question, please, Musimbi?
The growing conservatism, fundamentalism, regressive governments, and even regressive institutions of religions and cultures in every part of the world, pulling down the achievements that women have achieved so far, whether it is in laws, in practices, etc., changing what we think we have achieved.
I'll just add one thing. I'm sorry. I heard a different piece in what you said. So I think we need to acknowledge that we all have a variety of spectrum of spiritual orientation within all of the denominations of all of our faith traditions, and that there is not a monolith for any one right way or way to be Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Sikh, Buddhist, etc. And until we each stand up against that fundamentalism individually at the very micro level, we won't see change happen. And I think in particular to empower women into positions of leadership to oppose that kind of fundamentalist response, we won't see meaningful change. So that's where I would start.
To that, please. To add to what I use as usual, Wendy always inspires. If I may add, I think that the greatest error of judgment that women activists may have done till today is to confront religious fundamentalisms from a purely secular space of consideration. Obviously, that has to happen, but to continue to do so without joining forces with faith-inspired men and women who are also within their own respective traditions struggling against the multiple forms of fundamentalisms, economic, religious, political, they usually go together, by the way, without making those bridges with the faith-inspired communities who can themselves articulate the same religious discourse and paradigms, but articulate it as an alternative to the fundamentalist ones. That bridge has to be built. I'm up to here with feminists deciding that the biggest enemy is religious fundamentalism and going on about it incessantly for the last 50 years, not bothering to listen to the woman right next to them and the man right next to them who are well-versed and passionate about their faith tradition and have a very different reading from those. I think that bridge has to be built intentionally, or we will change nothing. We will simply increase the polarization.
I see Karima had something to say about it too, and Lopa.
So I just want to say maybe I have a slightly different perception of the activism around fundamentalism. I wrote a book that I mentioned in the chat where I interviewed hundreds of people, women, men of Muslim heritage, some practicing Muslim, some not, working against fundamentalism. And I found many people working with religious strategies, many people working with other strategies. Often these strategies were overlapping, or as Sana Banashur, the Tunisian feminist, says, porous. It's very hard sometimes to distinguish them. Sometimes the strategies oscillate. So I do think that there has been a diversity of strategies. I think we also have to understand that for women in certain contexts, I heard this in particular in North Africa and Francophone West Africa, the last thing that they want to do is shift onto the terrain of the fundamentalists, which is where every debate about public policy becomes a theological debate instead of, the broader debate about sort of the guarantees of the Constitution and human rights and so on. And I understand for people in certain contexts, that religious debate is one that they want to have, and they may be very equipped to have it. My own father went to Quranic school, and he was amazing at debating the fundamentalists in Algeria, sort of on their terrain. And I do think that that can be an important contribution. But I also respect very much that for some women, they see that as a huge step backward. That's not the debate that they want to have. They want to keep it a political debate. So I think we do have to respect this diversity of strategies. And I also think that I understand why some women in some contexts have seen religious fundamentalism as one of the leading obstacles to the advance of women's human rights, including in this country. And I'm very worried where I sit right now in the United States about the rise of Christian fundamentalism and what it means in this country. And it's taking power in the United States Supreme Court. So I do understand why people have identified this, but I share with Azza the view that we have to then be very thoughtful about how we work together to deal with it and to respond and to offer alternatives.
What I wanted to add to this conversation and these perspectives is actually, I think that, for me, I think that there is a certain binary around, fundamentalisms, non-fundamentalisms, and so on. The fact of the matter is that there is a framing within the UN from among member states, from among fundamentalists, from among autocracies around order and balance, and the idea that diversity, that different groupings of people in all their identities and in the way they want to be upset the order and balance, and that the order and balance and anything that challenges that dissent is disorder and imbalance and is leading us into chaos. And therefore that evoking of order and balance is also done from within the religious space, and therefore harking back to a gender ideology, traditional roles of women, traditional roles of men, and to get back into that space. And that's the discourse within conservative strains of religion, within autocracies, within the political space. And therefore, this idea of looking at at plurality, of intersectionality, of dissent, of activism, of citizens in all their diversity, complexity. Complexity enhances, plurality enriches, and that's where we are. That's what the world is. So to me, a really important role of faith leaders, faith institutions, feminist faith thinkers today is about having that conversation around this idea of a plural, democratic, political identity that center stages, whether it is faith, whether it is secularism, whether it is whatever is your means with which you engage in the world, but to understand that there is that order and is not about uniformity and homogeneity and authority.
Thank you. Our time is coming up, and I'm calling Mahnaz to give a last word. But I wanted to say a couple of things that I think I have found to be really true. I do very much agree with the fact that we must try and make sure that people can realize their rights without having to be tied to what they believe. That's really important. But at the same time, I want to say, after many years of working with women from all over the world, once you get into the spaces where people live, religion becomes very important. So I very much affirm women and feminists and women's movements specifically, who actually live in these settings and day in, day out, try to organize into movements that are able to unite and resist the things that are happening to them. Many of them do it to the extent of losing their lives. But I'm also very much encouraged when I see women making films, telling their stories, bringing the reality of how we can be able to really see that there is a growing conservatism that is affecting negatively the lives of women, and that it needs to be exposed. And we need to be able to be active for it in order for women to remain, to retain their dignity and their integrity in society. So there's a lot that can be done. I want to thank you, the panelists. I just feel like this is a subject we could do more with, and I'm sure that many women in many places are talking about the same things that we are doing. And more than talking, there are those who are actually doing something about it, whether it is from their values, from their cultures, from their faith, etc. And I want to affirm very much those organized faith communities that have been involved in justice and justice for women for many, many years, such as World Council of Churches. I see some of the people on the chat and several others of that nature are from many different types of faith communities. We affirm you as well for the work that you do. With this, I want to give back to Mahnaz for 1 minute to give us the last word.
Thank you. Thank you for the 1 minute. It's been such a rich, enormously satisfying exploration, and all of that has to be digested and written down and shared again with us and with the participants, which we will do. And also, I take your suggestion, Musimbi, very important one, that this is one of a series. Let's do more of it, because we've just begun to explore under the new circumstances. We have a long history, but not these new awareness and the new circumstances. So what I would sum up, I'm not summing up the speakers' wonderful statements, but what I get from what we have talked about is that in order to come up with the first steps toward a vision, a new vision, we have to do, as Wendy said, explore listening. And not just listening, but I think she includes hearing, because sometimes you listen, but they don't quite hear. I would like to address Lopa's question, and I would sum pessimism, but with a lot of optimism as well, that look at where we are, even after all these years of trying, but then the hope that the new vision and the new awareness of the failure of the systems will help us move forward. I would like to also recall Karima's conversation about universality of both the understanding and the practice of rights, in the sense that we all across the world, man, woman, and child, every color, every religion, want more or less the exact same rights. I have traveled all around the villages, towns, everywhere. There's not one place where you go that some of the people that you ask would not want one of the rights in the Declaration of Human Rights for their children. So universality of rights, but contextualization of how you communicate those rights, as Karima said, are very important. And us as statements so complex and so important, the faith communities, not in the sense of necessarily the faith discussions, but in the sense of the power of this enormous majority that they address collectively and singly. And the audience, the constituency is such a powerful one that for whatever we want to do, mobilization of the organizations and mobilization of the constituents is a fantastic project for us. Whatever religion we believe in or none at all, it doesn't matter. It's the idea that if we're talking about democracy, if we're talking about justice, if we're talking about rights, we're talking about the right to believe or not to believe. So that is a community that we have not mobilized as much as we want to. And also, I think that all have mentioned in one way or the other, the reactionary, the extremist kind of things that we see, actions and the policies and projects that we see around the world. It is, as Lopa mentioned, the longest struggle for rights across the world. And now we really have to snap out of our silos and talk about ourselves as who we are, the majority of the population of the earth, and go beyond equality. Unless we start with that, of reshaping the whole conversation, whether it's about religion, values, economics, politics, arts, underlying it, all of it is this systemic structure that does what it does to us badly in all of these areas. It no longer works. We have the obligation to snap out of the equality conversations and percentages and rethink the entire system. And I think this is our first of this group and of WLP of beginning a conversation on how do we do this. We all, one way or the other, realize it, but how are we going to do it? And I'm hoping that we will continue this. And I think one of the things we could ask, since 90% of the people of the world are doing this, is waking up every morning and wondering, what would God want me to do? And God may be the God of Abraham, the God of Muhammad, the God of Jesus. And if it's the God of Jesus, it would definitely be, as Bishop Tutu once said, a secular God, because Jesus was the one who said, leave Caesar's business to Caesar and God's business to God. So that's something to talk about as well. So whether we are secular in that sense, that we believe in the good that God would be thinking about, or whether we form it within a religion, it doesn't matter. We have to get together again as women and go beyond equality to try to get a new vision of how we're going to break out of our silos and meet the possibilities and the potential of our numbers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending this session. And as we close, we just send you to use every power, every tool that you have in your hands, your values, your faith, your activism, your advocacy, to be able to look for justice. And if you believe that part of it is joining in what worries God from a faith perspective and being part of that journey together with God, then this is also part of a journey that you could engage on. And most important, I think feminism is nothing other than pursuing justice for women, and therefore for all people, men and women. Because when we pursue justice for women, the results of that justice is that everybody benefits from that justice. There is no exception. So thank you again for attending this webinar, and best wishes to everybody. Bye-bye.